Good morning. I'm Jerry Baruch. I'm the board chair of the Bayou District Foundation in New Orleans, and glad to be here. Sorry I wasn't able to get here until late yesterday. I first met Tom Cousins and Carol Naughton and the Eastlake Foundation in 2005 in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, as we tried to figure out which direction New Orleans was going and sought for some creative ideas. Along with Mike Rodriguez and Gary Solomon, we worked with Carol to develop a vision in New Orleans for how we could remake public housing and truly address and change the cycle of poverty in a neighborhood which ultimately would ripple out across a broader community, as some have just talked about. In 18 city blocks, there were 1,300 public housing units in the former St. Bernard Public Housing Complex in New Orleans, which had 8 to 10 feet of water during Katrina. So what had been substandard housing became uninhabitable. Today, we've rebuilt 685 mixed-income housing units together with Columbia Residential. Those units have been 100% leased since we opened in 2010. And we have, as at Eastlake, reduced the crime rate by 99+%. We've actually had 3 felonies in the last 10 years now, where we had 684 felonies and 43 murders in the 4 years prior to Katrina in that neighborhood. So there's been dramatic change, but that's not just been because we've built back housing. We've built cradle-to-college education, Educare early learning. We just opened our KIPP K-8 school on site in the spring. 800 kids within that K-8 space. McDonough 35 High School in the neighborhood, which we are working to change the trajectory and ultimately bring that school to excellence as well as a federally qualified health center, community garden, and like Eastlake, we worked with City Park in New Orleans to build back Championship Public Golf, which serves as our economic engine, ultimately providing revenues to support our model over the long term. We've been able to leverage about $20 million of philanthropy to over $300 million of investment in the community over the last 12 years. Low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credits, a lot of creative finance. I started with hair, and here I am today, 10 years later, 12 years later. We've created about 300 permanent jobs and an annual budget of about $40 million that flows through the community, and about $14 million of salary generated through those jobs. So it's one that we are proud of, but we still see a long way to go. We were fortunate to host the first purpose-built community conference in New Orleans in 2010. We also hosted the fourth, and it's amazing to see how long a way that Bayou District and purpose-built have come over the last 10 years. My task here, actually, though, is not to talk about me, but to introduce our panelists. We're fortunate to have 2 national leaders with us this morning that are experts in economics, community development, housing, and real estate. Dr. Raphael Bostic came to Atlanta 2 years ago to lead the Federal Reserve here. He's an accomplished career in academics, government, and the nonprofit sector. He brings a very unique resume to lead a branch of the Federal Reserve and probably understands the work we all do as well as anybody in the Federal Reserve branch system. He has been engaged in community development and understands the challenges and opportunities inherent in all of our work. Egbert Perry has been in Atlanta a little longer. He actually was a part of our original visioning with Carol some 14 years ago, so a great friend. He's been a leader in the holistic community development, has been one of the great teachers in community development in this engaged work. Nationally, Egbert is one of the pioneers in mixed-income housing as he works to break the cycle of poverty in low-income communities. He's helped inspire what we now call the purpose-built model through his leadership of Centennial Place in downtown Atlanta, and as a key thought partner over the years to purpose-built communities, Bayou District, and many others. He has also been a leader at the national level, most recently as the chairman of Fannie Mae, where he helped guide them out of the Great Recession. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bostic and Egbert Perry.
It's always humbling sitting on a stage with Raphael. He is a scholar and an academic. He's an educator. He's a practitioner. He has been at HUD and led on policy issues and put them into practice in the field. And now he is the CEO of the Atlanta Fed. So he has sort of covered the waterfront. And what I would like to do is just open by having him tell you, as we talk about taking on the challenge of urban poverty, his view about, right now we do a lot of things in silos, and Raphael has a particular view of how we should attack the issue of urban poverty, perhaps by defining it differently to begin with, but then also talking about some of the strategies that he thinks are critical in really making headway in taking this on. So Raphael, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and then we'll figure it out from there.
Yeah, we got a lot to figure out. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. I want to thank Purpose Built for inviting me to be part of the program. It's really a privilege to be here and talk in the context of some really innovative work in economic development to change neighborhoods and to change people's lives. In thinking about urban poverty, it's a big problem. It's not a problem that's emerged over like a day or a week. This is something that really has happened from a broad-based structural perspective. And one of the challenges that we face that I've really tried to grapple with is that it's a short-run problem and it's a long-run problem. We got people that are struggling today who need help. But if we want that next generation to not face those same struggles, we have to invest in a whole bunch of infrastructure in our communities so that they create an access to opportunity. They allow people to build skills, and they allow people not to live stressed and afraid so that they can start to make investments and decisions that put them in a better place moving forward. And so the short run really is going to require some deep dive interventions really quickly to hit some strategic things and to really leverage opportunities that exist in today's environment. We talk a lot in our bank about opportunity occupations, which are jobs that don't require 6 years of schooling with a relatively small amount of training. You can be on a trajectory to have a job that's going to pay a wage. So you only need one job to be able to have housing and to eat well and to clothe your children and to get the medicine that you need. But that's only part of the way to go. And so you also need that deep dive into institutions. And I was fortunate to have gotten a tour of the Eastlake area a couple of weeks ago, and also just listening to the speakers at this morning's session and the dimensions that you hear people talk about: housing, education, health, food, public safety, community empowerment. Each of those is its own specialized field. But if they don't all fit together, if they don't mesh into a coherent collective, you can have great housing and still have a lot of chaos around. And people will not thrive in that environment. So you got to figure out ways to get it all fitting together in a way that as families live, they get that support collectively across all those dimensions. And then you really have a chance to move forward.
Good. No, that's good. And some of you may have seen, may not have. I was asked by ULI recently to write a paper on the Atlanta model, which is about this holistic community development. And one of the things that became clear when you have conversations, and we still run into some of the questions that were questions we were answering 25 years ago when people are trying to figure out, okay, where did the people go? How did you, was it good policy to break down these concentrations of poverty and so on? And did you just spread or throw the problem into a lot of different communities? And while we struggle under the banner of somehow we have an affordable housing problem, one of the things I say often is it's really not an affordable housing problem we're dealing with, because housing is really just one piece of the puzzle. And if that can be proven very readily, and I always use this example, and a few people from an audience one time came up to me because they were from a neighborhood or part of the city that I cited, and then they didn't appreciate me using that as an example. But I said, if you went out to West Atlanta, the furthest part, the least desirable part, and you bought maybe 150 acres of land, and you just built a whole bunch of housing at an affordable, and made it affordable there. So you've created maybe 50,000 units of affordable housing. That's what they say the gap is. Would you have solved the problem? And clearly, the answer is no. I don't think there'll be a long line of people looking to go and jump into a neighborhood that was just 100% affordable housing in a disconnected or remote part of the city. So if it's not an affordable housing problem, then what is it? And it's clearly a community development problem, because you're looking to have housing affordability in communities or neighborhoods where people with choice live or would want to live. And therefore, that's a community development problem, not housing. And if you think of all of the elements that make a community, we don't have to do a lot of scientific research to know what those are, because I would argue that 90% of the people in this room take for granted every day that they live in a neighborhood where there's a decent school and there are groceries and people have jobs. There's connectivity to transportation, whether it's transit or road, and so on and so forth. So why do we somehow think that poor people are a different species and they don't have the same aspirations, the same interests, and so on? But that's what we get caught up in. And so until we start looking at the issues or challenges through our own eyes and assume that the people that are adversely affected today or on the outside looking in have those same aspirations, we're never going to tackle the problem responsibly. We're going to always define it differently than the way we would define it if we looked at it through our own personal lens. So, Raphael, you're right on point, and the siloed treatments are clearly part of the problem. But you look at what has been done by Purpose Built and with the East Lake community, and that is the epitome of what it should be when you integrate all of these aspects of healthy communities to create something that anybody in this room, and probably some already in this room, want to go trekking to live there because it's a desirable community.
But one thing that you said, which I think is actually interesting in this context, is that...
He didn't say correct, he said interesting. Notice his choice of words.
So we should just assume that anything Egbert says is correct. That's kind of where you start, and then we sort of leapfrog off of that. I've learned my lesson. So is that you think about East Lake, and I was not here at the time, but East Lake was not a neighborhood of preference. You used to call it a neighborhood of choice. It was not. It was a place that was further out. The Kroger was, I think it was like a murder Kroger type thing. People did not go out there unless they absolutely had to. And I've heard people tell stories that they didn't go after dark, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. And what has happened in the purpose-built context is that a neighborhood that was not a neighborhood of choice has now become a neighborhood of choice, and it's become a place because it has all of the infrastructure that provides access to opportunity that people want to live. When we did our tour, there were a number of houses that were going up at high prices, right? And I was struck by the idea that this place that used to be on the outside, like the far outside, is now not so far on the outside, may actually be on the inside. And that's an interesting change. You know, when I was at HUD, and we were talking about and reviewing our affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation, which is a planning regulation that really asks communities, like, how, if you have your resources, how are you spending them? And are those expenditures really changing people's experience in living on a day-to-day basis over time? And we would go around and talk to communities, and they would say, we think this is a great idea. I love the philosophy, but who's really doing this? Like, can you give us examples of places where we've seen the types of investments at the public sector level that have translated into a neighborhood on the outside becoming a neighborhood on the inside? And the number of places that do that is extremely small, particularly when you consider just the public sector. Right? And so this notion of partnerships, this notion of collaboration, this notion that the expertise has to go beyond a small number of people who feel like they have a public mission. This needs to be something that is community-oriented, that gets the buy-in from participants and community members, and sometimes not even community members, who are going to come in and say, look, we collectively will be better off if this place is better off, and so we're going to be willing to commit to that. That's a really important thing, and that can help catalyze the notion that we get to a community of choice.
That's right. You know, interestingly, and I heard some of the comments in the previous panel about the food deserts, and if you want to, I guess the question is, how do you become, there's a joke in the islands where they say, ask the question, how do you become a millionaire? And it's, start with $1 billion and go to the Caribbean and try to build hotels. Well,
there's got to be another answer than that.
Yeah, because I don't really appreciate that. That's a negative image.
My friend's from the West Indies too,
That's,
so yeah,
good point. Okay, so forget that.
Scratch the tape.
Yes,
scratch
exactly.
the tape.
But the reality is, and this is where this is a very provocative statement, right? And I will announce that coming out the gate. But people talk about gentrification, and gentrification is this negative thing, and I get asked about that oftentimes, and they'll say, well, you are one of the drivers or influences of gentrification in the city. And I should take a step back and say, 25 years ago, Integral is 27 years, but 27 years old. 25 years ago, we conceived the model of holistic community revitalization and did the first such community in the country. And it so happened it was at the site of what was the first public housing project ever built in the country, which was Techwood Homes. And we got to it really by accident. I was on business with the firm I was with a few years before in New York, and my buddy who worked at the Bank of New York was going to the meeting with me, and he picked me up early, drove me through Harlem on the way to the east side of Manhattan where the meeting was. And when we got there, he asked, okay, man, so why does this look like this and that look like that, and what would it take to make that look like this? And I said, I don't know. Let me answer a different question. What would that need to look like for me to want to live there? And I started talking, and then he hit me on the hand and said, okay, you've been talking extemporaneously for 15 minutes with passion. Perhaps you shouldn't be doing what you're doing now. You should quit that and carry out what you just described. And I said, okay, I will do that if you quit what you're doing. And he had been with the Bank of New York for 13 years. You quit what you're doing, and we'll start a company to do this. And that's how Integral got created. But what I described on that bench was the Antigua I grew up in, because I was describing you needed a great school, you needed great housing, it needed to be agnostic of income. Income should have been irrelevant. I tell people now every black person a generation ago was poor. That's the way the country was set up. So it's not an important statement to say we were poor, but to put it in context in today's world. I'm number 9 of 11 kids. My family made $2,500 EC a year, Eastern Caribbean dollars. So that's about $1,000 US. I got the best education you can get on the island, and in those days, it was as good or better than the best education you got in high school here. And it cost $33 a term, $100 EC a year for a kid to go to school. And every one of my parents' 11 children, well, actually one died, 10 children, went to school in the US, graduated from college and so on. It's because poverty was not a crime in Antigua in those days. So you could be poor, but still have access to all the things that help with upward mobility. Ironically, in the great countries of the world, and we're in one right now, poverty is a crime. And the sentence for that crime is you're going to go to the worst schools, you're going to live in the worst, unnurturing neighborhoods, and your trajectory is set this way before you even leave the womb, especially if you're black or brown. That's the construct. And anything that changes that trajectory, even to level or slightly up, usually requires great intervention, tremendous intentional intervention. And if you think about it, that's what Eastlake is doing. That's what the communities we've developed were trying to do. And it shouldn't be like that. That should be the norm. So, Raphael, you're bringing to the Fed something that the Fed really isn't charged with doing, right? You're sort of writing your own.
Oh, no.
You're writing your own job description. I'm sorry, the Fed president shouldn't be. You've written your own job description.
Yeah, but that's what Fed presidents do,
Okay,
right?
they write their own job
So we have a few things that we have to do.
Okay.
But then there are other things we get to engage in. And a lot of how we write that other part of our job description is really about how we interpret our mission.
Okay.
Right, so the Fed gets a mandate, stable prices, maximum employment, financial stability. And so the question is, how do we think about those? Mm-hmm. And then how does that relate to the communities in which we're located? And for me, I decided I'm going to define maximum employment and think about it in a different way.
Okay.
And really ask the question, what's the appropriate metric for thinking about whether we've achieved maximum employment or not? Should we be satisfied with a metric where we're pretty confident that a whole bunch of people aren't going to be employed? Mm-hmm. Or are there things that we might do to try to say, okay, maximum employment means maximum. Let's get as many people as we possibly can in that mix, because then the economy grows faster, it's more resilient, it's more innovative, and it's more competitive in an increasingly competitive global environment. So I actually don't see the discussion around economic development, personal empowerment, getting people connected into institutions that can get them skills and allow them to innovate and be entrepreneurs as that far a reach from what the Fed should be doing anyway.
Okay.
I think I may be more throaty on it than some others have been, but I think it really fits fundamentally into what we're doing. And another thing I would say is that more and more of my colleagues are thinking the way I'm thinking.
Oh, good.
So if you think about the Boston Fed, they have a Working Cities Challenge. They're actually got partnerships with philanthropy to try to help local communities redevelop some of their neighborhoods. You think about things that we're doing with St. Louis Fed and the Philadelphia Fed and the Richmond Fed around education and financial literacy at the 5th grade level, at the 8th grade level, to try to get those things instilled. Think about the Kansas City Fed, they're doing a CRA type of challenge to help partner banks with local projects and communities.
And San Francisco
And I was just
right?
getting San Francisco. San Francisco has a whole series of volumes. They've done a lot of work here with Purpose Built, asking the question, well, what works? What counts? Like, how should we think about examples that have succeeded? So the Fed's got our fingerprints all over this. And actually, just I think yesterday, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis co-authored an op-ed with former Supreme Court, Supreme Court Justice of the state of Minnesota, Alan Page, decrying the disparity in outcomes for people in the Minneapolis area. So we're out there and we're doing a lot. We don't do grants. Right, so the way we do it is going to look different. But this is something that's pretty core to the success of our regions. And if our regions don't succeed, then we've got bigger problems.
So that's interesting. So just so you know how radical this is, and what Raphael doesn't say is people are copying him because he is not prototypical. I was on the board of the Atlanta Fed from 2001 through 2008. There was no Raphael Bostic. Now, I don't want to diminish the other Fed presidents, but the point is that was not something that Fed presidents saw as the way in which to express themselves and self-actualize while also doing this very important and significant role with the economy. And so what Raphael is doing is not something we should take for granted, because it's highly unusual for a Fed president to sort of come down into doing the people's work, because it was always sort of viewed as ivory tower. So
we do the people's work.
I get it.
There are many different ways to do
yes.
this. Look, I actually think that we are going to be a better organization for this sort of engagement.
Absolutely.
We'll be better connected with our communities. And I've been struck, just to support what you're saying, I go around and talk about this all the time now, and the usual response is, I had no idea the Fed cares about this. I didn't know the Fed had people that worked on this stuff. So there's definitely work to do to get our brand and our passion on this much more broadly known, so that we can be the full and committed partner that we'd like to be in many contexts.
Okay, so I want to shift a little bit and introduce a topic. So Raphael and I sort of, we didn't do this, but we kind of skated around the edges of it, because somebody asked, what would it take? We were in a discussion in front of a big audience once, and somebody asked all of the participants, there were 4 of us on the stage, what would it take to get people engaged in this work? And I made a comment sort of along the lines of, make it personal, or take it on as a personal challenge, see yourself in the place of the individuals that you're trying to help, and then what you should do becomes pretty easy and obvious to articulate. When it got to Raphael, he said, if you're expecting people to do things because it's the right thing, that's probably wasted energy. And so we went back and forth a little bit, and I'm curious to hear, I know that was a while ago, but whether there's any view you have on that, because this audience clearly is probably singing to the choir, because they're all pretty much focused on this work.
So what I would say is this, I did not say wasted energy.
Okay.
What I said was not sufficient.
Okay, fair enough.
Right,
okay.
in the sense that Look, words matter, right? Words matter.
They do.
So, one of the things that, particularly in affordable housing, which is where I've seen this the most, is that there's a lot of frustration that it's obviously the right thing to do. Why isn't everybody voting for this? Why can't we get like broader based support? And the thing, my retort, like I'm an economist, and sometimes it just comes down to like bald interest, is if people don't think that it's a problem that's affecting them, right? They're busy, they're running around. Like, it's going to be a high bar for them to actually be willing to engage and be willing to invest their resources and their time. And so part of our challenge is to make it real and say, look, if we fail on this, it makes your life worse, right? And that is an important part of all of these discussions. So you think about neighborhood revitalization. Right? One thing that I try to remind people is that when neighborhoods don't work, right, there are extra costs that we incur as a society that we are all paying, right? So we're either going to pay now or we're going to pay later.
Right.
Why don't we pay now so that the costs actually become payments?
Right.
Because the people who would have been costly to us are now contributing to our society. They're innovating, they're coming with new products, they're helping to make our lives better, right? And so I don't always talk about it in an economic context, but it is important to understand that for those of us who aren't knee deep in it or shoulder deep in it, we're going to have to work harder to pull them to get attention, awareness, and a willingness to put some of their time and energy into this.
Yes.
And a lot of that's going to require some self-interest.
Fair enough, and that's, I get that, and people are busy living their lives, and you've got to find a way to get them.
So, I moved here from Los Angeles, and one of the things that's emerged recently is the problem with the homeless. And in Los Angeles, for a long time, people didn't know that, well, they kind of knew they were homeless, but they didn't really know because you could drive past, you never see them. And it can be easy for these problems to be invisible. And if they're invisible, then, at some level it doesn't really matter to me, so I can do other things. It was only when the awareness became so large, the costs started being borne by a broader set of communities, that the region came together and passed a bond to raise, I think it's $1 billion, to provide homeless services and build buildings, right? And so it took a different kind of understanding, a collective understanding that this was our cost. And if we don't do something about it, we're all going to wind up paying in a whole host of other ways that we'd rather not pay. So I think it's an important tool or arrow in the quiver. And I mess up all those sort of analogies. But it's an approach or a strategy that I think is really important to not forget. That
you're right.
If we're going to build a broader coalition, we got to make it easy for folks to see why they should be part of it.
And so, and that's true. And the reason mixed income came in, and by the way, I always am fascinated at how everybody throws around, oh, we need mixed income housing and so on and so forth. And you hear it now, it's ubiquitous, the term is. Roll back the clock to 1995, 94, 95, when we started talking about creating mixed income housing, again, emulating that housing in Antigua. It wasn't mixed income housing as we know it. It wasn't organized to be that, but the person to our right was a pharmacist. The people who lived next to us was a merchant, and then next to that person was a barber shop in a house, and so on. It was a mixed income community, common values, various incomes. When we went to DCA, Department of Community Affairs, to tell them we wanted to create this holistic mixed income community at Centennial, there was no mixed income. It didn't exist. The concept didn't exist. We had to get DCA to be willing to put mixed income in the qualified allocation plan. And the executive director of the Georgia Housing Finance Agency, allowed Renee Glover and me to sit in the room as he called each board member on the board of the Georgia Housing Finance Agency. For about 3 hours we sat there. He would dial a board member who may be in Valdosta or some other remote parts of the state, and we would explain to them what we're talking about with mixed income and why it was what was needed. And I will tell you, there were things in the state's tax credit program, like you could only do modest design. So carpet and air conditioning were considered a luxury. So we had to get that changed. And the selling of that was, you can't create a mixed income community with nice units that have carpet and air conditioning and some that don't, and have them in the same development, because then you would be creating Buckhead and Bankhead in the same development, and that doesn't work. Those are things that you had federal law, state law, city laws, county laws that had to be changed to make mixed income possible. So you arrive today like Columbus, and you don't realize, well, that was yesterday, sorry. And you don't realize that there's a lot that happened to even make the landscape as it's set today possible.
So if I could just jump in here, because there is one piece that I think is, that overarches everything that you just talked about, which is vision, right? And having a vision for what you thought was necessary for a housing development to succeed and for a community to succeed. And I think that actually is, one of the challenges we have in redeveloping and revitalizing communities, right? Getting the community to coalesce around a vision so that resources all get pointed in the same direction, so people are all looking in the same direction, and you don't see sort of a dissipation of resources. And this is one of those areas where we have, I think, some of the biggest challenges, because in neighborhoods where they have not been connected, they don't have good institutions and those sorts of things, it's hard to find the group of people who's going to come together, sit down and take the time to wrestle and develop a vision that then you can see investments targeted toward and oriented around. And I think about opportunity zones as an example of this. Opportunity zones work best when a community knows what they want investments in their neighborhood to do.
That's right.
But many communities have never had that conversation, right? And so the investors come in, these funds come in, like, we'd love to do something. And communities are like, well, I don't even know what to tell you, because we have not had the time, or no one's given us space to develop a vision to guide our conversation to get us moving forward. And so, for me, I think this notion of vision and how we create opportunities for neighborhoods that we think should aspire to do better, and maybe are aspiring to do better, can start to articulate so they can make demands on the world around them. Because the world is going to do stuff.
Right.
And if we don't sort of direct it and channel it, it will wind up doing things that aren't fully helpful for us. And so this vision, I think, in the context of purpose-built, I think the community quarterback plays a big role in getting folks together to say, look, we got to figure out what we're going to do. Like, our nonprofits and our institutions all have to agree to some extent about what this journey is going to look like. But there are lots of places that don't have that. And you're a visionary. You had the vision. You are willing to go and change the regs, basically, to have that vision play out. That's a level of commitment that very few people have. But if we want big change, we got to train people to understand. That's part of the game here, right? That you got to get your vision and then figure out where the blockers are, and then we're going to change them. So that they're facilitators rather than blockers.
Cool. All right, so I'm past the time where I should have reached out to you guys with questions. So we're going to try and speed date, and we'll both try and be fast in our responses.
We would be remiss if we did not ask about choice neighborhoods. We have a session tomorrow on that topic. And Raphael, given your experience at HUD and Egbert's your knowledge of choice neighborhood programs, we're curious as to whether you guys, how would you evaluate the relative success of choice neighborhoods as a program? What would you have done differently, Raphael, if you were still at HUD and had the ability to shape that program? And just in general, how would you characterize federal policy, and to the extent that it is or is not supportive of the kind of work that we do at purpose-built neighborhood revitalization work?
So that's a bigger, there are like 6 questions in there.
Take 15 to 20 seconds.
So I view Hope 6 to choice neighborhoods or promised neighborhoods as a series of learning.
Right.
And there was an initial concept, there was a recognition that it wasn't broad enough, so they kept broadening it, and we continue to broaden it.
Right.
To try to get to this notion that you do need to hit all these dimensions at the same time if you're going to see change that's going to endure and change people's lives. So, when they did Hope 6, I think there was a belief that that would be enough. Mm-hmm. And I think the experience was that it just wasn't, and that we needed to do more.
Yes. And I echo that completely. I think the Hope 6 was only as comprehensive as promise and choice have evolved to become. Hope 6 was sort of the foundation, but very few people did what we did with it and what Eastlake did with it. A lot of people just used it as a source of funding to do housing and nothing else. And so all of these other things never really got done. We view the subsequent programs, Choice and Promise, as codification of the more progressive Hope 6 solutions that were implemented. That's really what it is. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I don't have a question, but I would like to commend both of you men for the platform that you have given us this morning, but I wanted to just add a little bit from my perspective regarding Eastlake and the affordable housing component model that we speak of, and how do we progress and move it forward. One of the things in Eastlake that I think a lot of people don't give attention to is that when the partners and stakeholders were coming together to develop Eastlake, one of the key components was including the residents as stakeholders and including them in the whole process of viewing them as partners, not going into a community talking at the residents in which this change will affect, but pulling them in to have them as a part of the stakeholder and sitting around the table to see how these measures can better benefit them as well, because it will ultimately affect them initially and throughout their generations of how we can connect these communities and the progress of development. So community development has 2 words. It's a community. Community means every person affected. That means the businesses, the schools, the medical facilities, the residents, everyone's affected. Those are your interagencies set up. That's where you pull everybody together and have every piece of person represented around that table for a successful deal. You can't go into anyone's neighborhood and tell them what you want for them because you don't know what's best for them. The best thing to do is inclusion, not exclusion. Pull them together, partner, and get your voices to work for you and not against you. The residents actually, they're your best marketing.
So can I jump in here? Because you've articulated a thesis which is very clear, but I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion, right? And we have many examples of developers going in and redoing cities and neighborhoods without ever asking anybody any questions. And that has actually informed a lot of approaches today. You think about urban renewal, Think about where the freeway system went. Right? There are lots of decisions that have been imposed on neighborhoods. I think what you're talking about is a philosophy, right? And an important philosophy that says, if we're going to develop, we want to develop in a way such that the people who have lived in the neighborhoods are beneficiaries of that investment as well. Like, that's an important thing. And too often what's happened is that these investments have happened, different people are beneficiaries, and the people who have lived in these neighborhoods for a long time get just pushed around.
Right.
Right? And they start over in neighborhoods that aren't appreciably better. And we need to not have that cycle continue if we're going to break these cycles of intergenerational poverty, of neighborhood poverty, and all those sorts of things.
So I'm going to ask the last question. I'm open it for the last question. And Carol, are you going to be the last question?
Tammy was up here before me. So
All right. So I have two questions because I can't say no to Carol ever. So
Okay, then I'll go first, Carol.
go ahead.
Thank
Okay.
you. Tammy Hoy Hawkins, Spartanburg, South Carolina, North Side. So affordability is an equation, a math equation, right? So we've been talking a lot about affordable housing, but I wanted to hear a little bit about the economic side, which is the income side. So we know that folks don't get paid what they should get paid, or we talk about the Federal Reserve Bank and full employment, and we have millions of folks that have background issues. And so I know there's a lot of innovation going on out there around getting folks fully employed with criminal records. And we have I think I've recently heard Fifth Third presentation in Columbus, like 12 million individuals that could be employed if we did something around backgrounds. And so I would just love to hear from you all, because that's the other side of this equation.
So I'm glad you talked about that, because I say this all the time. In many places, the affordable housing problem is not about the cost of building. It's
Right.
about people don't have incomes. I can build as inexpensively as possible, and the rent I'd need is still too high for people. So we got to get people jobs that pay wages that can support the expenditures that they're going to need to do. In terms of your question on dealing with records, what I've heard, and as the market has gotten tighter, more and more employers are revisiting that requirement to say, look, we need workers. Many people who have been incarcerated are actually looking for a fair shot to sort of start themselves on a right path, and we should give it to them. So that's happening now, and I would expect that that's going to continue, because many folks who get that second shot are going to make the most of it. They're actually going to be your best workers, their hardest workers, because they know they're not going to get another one.
That's right.
Right. So conversations around that are important, and I would encourage more and more folks to think about that.
So, and I'll connect two things there. Going back to that comment about food deserts and so on and so forth. Just keep in mind, I don't know any business that says, I want to go and locate in a community where the people can't buy my services, can't afford to pay for them. So disposable income in a community is important. And we are importing, gentrification brings in disposable income by bringing people from the outside in, and that actually helps because you can attract goods and services, or providers of goods and services, because the communities have more income. And you're going to always be subsidizing if you don't have that disposable income. But bringing it in from the outside is one avenue. The other one is to grow it, to help people in the community actually access decent jobs. So you've got to do a little bit of both, import and grow organically from inside.
And let me just say one other thing,
Okay.
because I have to do some commercial. You guys should go to our website. We have lots of material. So I think we just released a tool that allows you to identify opportunity occupations at the county level. So you can see for every county in the country where or what jobs there are that are available that people can get to with simple certifications and that sort of thing, to start to have a conversation about, like, where are your opportunities?
Got it.
Because we want people to be aware and be able to make choices such that they can get to that level of income,
Okay.
such that this becomes less of a problem.
Good. And you're welcome. And if you want to get people to pay attention and take this as something they should care about, here is a little bit of a prescription. Ask the people in a room how many of them are taking their mortgage interest deduction on April 15th when they file their taxes. And everyone that raised their hands, let them know they are living off the public dole. They're living in subsidized housing. Nobody has gone as far as to call it public housing, but they live in public housing. And the subsidy they receive is usually multiples of what people that are receiving public housing assistance get. And so if you all of a sudden had to walk around letting people know you live in public housing because you're taking the subsidy, you'd probably have a different view of those people that live in public housing. One more thing. When you hear laws passed like, okay, if you are in public housing and you commit a crime, somebody in the household commits a crime, you're now evicted, you're no longer eligible for public assistance. Think about your kid that gets picked up for smoking pot and is now a criminal, and you no longer can take the mortgage interest deduction or are now ineligible for any federal assistance, and see how you like those apples. You probably don't. So there are a lot of hypocrites in this room and in rooms all over the country that are both parasites and hypocrites. They're living off the public dole, but they speak negatively and look down on other people who are getting public assistance. Okay? Carol, last question.
Thank you. This has been terrific. Thank you both for your time and your thoughts and your leadership on all these issues. Last night we heard from Richard Rothstein and talking about the causes of segregation and the government actions that created the segregated communities that we live with today. I think we all look in our world as both segregation and concentrated poverty as enemies of opportunity and hope. I'd be interested to hear from each of you, as a developer, as an economist, what kind of policy levers you think might be helpful in pushing back against segregation and against concentrated poverty.
So just to start, we're right across the street from here, and we have a museum on the first floor, open to the public. In the museum right now, we have an exhibition on redlining and the history of redlining, particularly in Atlanta. And it really does lay out and define the trajectory of wealth building for those who are inside the red line as contrasted with those outside the red line. And that drives a lot of the disparities that we see right now. Moving forward, I think really hard about how do we improve our school system so that every child has a real fighting chance to be competitive for the jobs that pay the highest wages. I think that's an important thing. I think finding ways to get people real access to communities that have higher levels of opportunity, whether that be more jobs, whether it be better schools, whether it be entrepreneurial capital, small business investments, all those sorts of things, because we also have a spatial separation of just employment opportunity. That is a significant barrier in many of our metropolitan areas. So those would be two places I'd start. And a third thing I would do, and this is probably more nebulous and it has not been really well thought out, but it is really try to change the notion of expectations for young people. I've been struck by how many people from lower income communities when you ask kids that are 9 and 10 what you're hoping to be, it's a secretary, it's a janitor. It's not an astronaut, it's not an attorney, it's not a surgeon, right? They've self-censored their hopes and dreams at very early ages. And if they're not aspiring then, when they get to 16, 17, and they start applying for college, if they're going to do that, I know so many people, their stretch college was Fort Valley State. Wasn't Georgia Tech, wasn't Emory, right? And so those, and that's a fine institution, but that's constraining the set of networks you're going to have, the set of relationships you're going to have, and it really does limit what the upside potential is. So we got to do better in making sure that all of our children dream, like really dream, so that when they get to those crossroads, they try to stretch and be more. Because when they do that, a whole bunch of them are going to succeed, and that will help to break the chain.
Well, there's hardly much I can add to that. I mean, that's a pretty comprehensive policy prescription. I would say a way to look at it, and not necessarily to add to it, we always talk about, in economics, you talk about the basket. You know, the basket has housing and gas and other things that you need. If we ever change the basket for what it takes to have healthy communities, and we put in all of these elements that we talk about with education and housing and transportation and so on, and consider those and access to health care, put those in a basket and say, this is what every citizen needs to have access to, and we need jobs that will make access to those things readily available to each household. And then our work becomes easier in defining what the problem is we're trying to solve. I think right now, to an earlier point Raphael made, we all get caught up in defining the problem the way we see it without the input of or any ability to relate to the people on the ground that are experiencing the barriers. And so defining the problem properly and then writing policy to fit that is critical. I always say what we have is mind over matter. The people who write policy today don't mind if the policy is bad policy, because the people that are destroyed by that bad policy don't matter. And so we need to have a very clear connection between our policy prescriptions and the problems that we're trying to solve. And the problem has to be defined in a way that it is strategic, thoughtful, et cetera, et cetera. Raphael, thank you very much for your time. And thank all of you for allowing us to participate in this experiment.
Yeah, thank you all.